Actually, that didn't happen until college, and really until I completed my undergraduate career. Originally, coming from a small rural area in eastern North Carolina, my intention was to go into the military, which a lot of my high school classmates had done. But I'd done very well on the ASVAB, and to that recruiter's credit, he encouraged me to go to college and get an ROTC. So my 4 years of undergrad, I was an Air Force ROTC, anticipating a career in the military. But I always had bad vision, and the Soviet Union collapsed in the years in which I was there, and so the need for more people involved in the military declined. And so things they would have waived before, they weren't waiving, and so I had to come up with a new career. And so this is really the story. Literally, I was sitting on the steps on the Helen Edmonds building at Central's campus, and the chair of the Department of History, Dr. Percy Murray, was coming back from lunch, and he saw me sitting on the steps, and he to him there appeared to be something wrong. He asked me, and I said, well, no worries, it's okay. He said, no, something's wrong, come to my office and talk to me. So when I went to his office and talked with him, he said, okay, I understand your story. Well, why don't you get a master's in history? My undergraduate degree was actually in political science. And so he said, why don't you get a master's in history? So here, fill out this application. And literally, I filled out the application, and that's how I got started. So, and then to make a long story shorter, after I got into the program, it's a 2-year program, and you have to do a master's thesis, and I didn't know what to write about. And so I asked my major professor, Dr. David Bishop, I said, well, what can I write about my hometown, my community? And he said, yes, because if you don't do it, nobody else will. And that's when I really, had fallen in love with history. I mean, I knew my community and loved my upbringing and loved my community, but learned more about that community from doing the master's thesis, and then that developed the rest of my career. I grew up in a community called Indian Woods. So it's we're Indian Woods, it's just a community. Everyone takes it for granted. Clearly, you can see the people in the community. There are various mixtures and backgrounds. And so we always understood that, we had some native mix, but we didn't really know. People would say we're Cherokee, that was just kind of the common thing. In North Carolina, people say they're Cherokee. But the reservation, it was a reservation, Indian Woods Reservation. It was established in 1717 for the Tuscarora Indians. And so I became curious about, one, the history of this community, which was mixed race. They had Indians, blacks, and whites. People shared that heritage. We're triracials. And once I learned that the group was Tuscaroras, I wanted to know more about them, because I'd never heard anything about Tuscaroras in North Carolina, nor did I hear very much about them in history other than the Tuscarora War. And then after they were defeated in the Tuscarora War, they kind of disappeared from North Carolina history. So I wanted to know more about the Tuscaroras. And I have to also state that really what got me really excited about my community, Indian Woods, is because when I was in the graduate program at Central, I took a North Carolina history course. And Leffler and Newsom, who were professors at UNC Chapel Hill. And in the first couple of pages, the first chapter, first couple of pages, they mentioned my community by name, Indian Woods. Indian Woods was given to the Tuscarora Indians at the close of the Tuscarora War. And so I said to myself, well, if these two great historians mentioned my little town, my little community, rural area by name, it must be significant. And I need to know more about it. And so do our, the folks who are from there, who live there. And that's really what got me into it, because, you don't just hear some little small rural area like that mentioned in a North Carolina history textbook, unless it's significant. For those of us who grew up in Indian Woods, we were who we were. We were family, we're people. Yes, you can look at people and see some had, Asiatic features, some had green eyes, blue eyes, some were dark skinned with blue eyes, some were fair skinned, some were even fair enough to pass for white with green eyes. I mean, you saw the diversity of the community, but we were family and we were all cousins, and nobody, everybody took it for granted. And so it wasn't until I became interested in the history of Indian Woods and the nation, the Tuscarora Indians that resided there, that I became more aware of triracial communities, and that we were not the only one. That many of the Tuscaroras had intermixed with Europeans and Africans and had these characteristics, and you could find these communities scattered around the eastern United States, many of which were connected to the Tuscarora diaspora, that had the same characteristics. So all of the communities I found, whether we're talking about Melungeons in Appalachia, or we're talking about Brass Ankles down in South Carolina, or we're talking about my community, all of the communities tended to be rural, isolated communities where the families had intermarried for generations, for in fact hundreds of years in some cases, and were very closed community, very protective. But collectively, large numbers of these communities and large numbers of people, if you look at North Carolina, the Lumbees don't often like to be considered triracials, but they are triracials, and you'll see numerous communities of people who either consider themselves African American, Indian, or black, but they all basically look the same. They're the same, complexions. They really come from the same areas. It's just that each group of people decided to either identify themselves as Indian or identify themselves as African American, or they blended into the white population or remained Indian, what they consider themselves, as Indian. Yes, in fact, the Tuscaroras, and this is, again, from this research, I did not realize how significant they were. So I said, okay, well, this was a Tuscarora reservation, so most of the people here who are of mixed heritage are part Tuscarora. But I did not realize until I started doing my research on my master's thesis and later dissertation that the Tuscaroras were part of a larger group of Indians who were Iroquois, who we call the Six Nations, or the Iroquois Confederacy, which included the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. And the Tuscaroras, they collectively were called the Six Nations. The Tuscarora was a Six Nation. And this group of Indians were the most influential and powerful group of Indians in the history of North America. And they had a confederation, a democracy, in which they all equally supported each other, and really inspired the creation of the U.S., Constitution, and our government, what we call the U.S. government. It really inspired that, beginning with Franklin and early colonialists who were trying to unite the colonies to basically protect themselves against or stand against the Iroquois Confederacy. But the Iroquois also were known to be in opposition to slavery, and they were considered northeastern woodland Indians. And slaves who ran away, and remember, a lot of people forget this too, but slavery existed in all 13 colonies. So slavery existed in Massachusetts, as well as Vermont and New Hampshire, as well as Maine, Maryland, all of the early colonies. Maine, of course, was part of Massachusetts at that time, but all of the early colonies in the Northeast, as well as in the South, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, Delaware, all practiced slavery. And on the frontier of all of the 13 colonies was the Six Nations, territory. And whenever Africans or slaves ran away to, the Six Nations, they refused to return them. And this is well documented. And even in North Carolina, if we talk about Virginia pushing down into northeastern North Carolina, as slaves ran away into eastern North Carolina, they often took refuge with the Tuscaroras, and they never returned slaves. Oftentimes people forget that there were, substantial Indian nations in North America prior to Columbus's arrival. And in North Carolina, there were significant nations of Indians, or numbers of Indians, and then various distinct nations. In southwestern North Carolina, you have the Catawba Nation, which pretty much stretched, south of the Catawba River, a little on the, eastern side or northern side of the Catawba, but basically on the western side of the Catawba River, in and around the Charlotte area and southward into South Carolina. Then north of that, and particularly the Cape Fear River, you had the Tuscaroras. They pretty much controlled things from, the Cape Fear River northward to what we call the Nottoway River, which runs into Virginia, the Meherrin and Nottoway rivers that run into Virginia. So they were the most significant nations. So the different nations interacted with each other. They warred with each other. You had the Tuscarora Indians, and who were confederated with the Iroquois. You had the Siouan Indians, the Catawbas, and the Tutelos and Petees, who were in South Carolina, and they tended to be confederated with the Cherokees, Creeks, but the southeastern Indians, and then the Powhatans, who kind of stood alone and at times basically aligned themselves with the Iroquois, but then when Europeans came, they aligned themselves with the English who settled in Virginia. So you basically have, areas in North Carolina where there are, smaller tribes certainly, but you have these major tribes. They trade with one another, they war with one another, but they have, well-defined territories, hunting territories, as well as areas in which they, they cultivate, agricultural crops, and they have houses. And as a footnote to that pre-Columbian versus European, one of the things I think many North Carolinians forget is that if we look at all of our cities, if we talk about New Bern was placed on the site of the old Tuscarora capital. That was the capital of the Tuscarora Confederation. And so when we, destroyed the Tuscarora Confederation, on top of that Confederacy, on top of that capital, we built our new capital, which was New Bern. The first capital in Edenton, when the Indians in the Northeast were defeated, these were Algonquin-speaking peoples, when they were defeated, then we placed Edenton there, the capital of colonial North Carolina. So many of our towns and cities, whether we're talking about Greenville or talking about New Bern or we're talking about Goldsboro or Rocky Mount, most of these towns and cities were basically built on top of what were major Indian villages or trading areas, trading centers, because these were usually very good land near rivers that didn't flood. They had good fertile land that you could farm. So the Indians were doing the same things that the Europeans later would do. They found areas that were safe, that were productive, and they settled on those places and raised their families and had their villages there. And so when the Europeans come in, those are precisely the areas that they want, and the areas are already cultivated. It's not like we often think of this as a wilderness, and it's a lot of just woods. And although there were far more woods than there are today, definitely the Indians had villages and towns, and those villages and towns basically were taken over by the settlers. So it's important to understand, and I think a lot of folks oftentimes don't fully understand this either. Native people prior to the arrival of Europeans had conflicts, the same way that Europeans had conflicts. I mean, the Spanish didn't get along with the English, and the English didn't get along with the French, and the French didn't get along with the Dutch. I mean, there were these internal conflicts in Europe that were then brought to the New World. Well, in the New World, there were conflicts as well. The Cherokees didn't get along with the Tuscaroras. Tuscaroras didn't get along with the Catawbas. And so there were conflicts and there were wars. But what I often say to people, you have to understand the difference between native conflicts and wars and European conflicts and wars, and what the Europeans brought to, this dynamic. Native peoples, of course, fought with bows and arrows, war clubs, etc. And so when they engaged each other in conflict and wars, you might have injuries, and you might have some that were somewhat severe, but you had few deaths from these engaged conflicts. When Europeans arrived and they brought guns and they brought artillery, and then they sided with Indians. Cherokees, aligned themselves with the Europeans, in South Carolina and Georgia, and the Powhatans aligned themselves with the English coming into the Chesapeake Bay at Jamestown. They bring their technology, their weapons, and use those weapons when they engage traditional enemies. The Powhatans were not necessarily super friendly with the Tuscaroras, so they had conflicts, but the Tuscaroras had enough people and were powerful enough that they were able to maintain their territories, and through their alliances with the Iroquois and their allies, maintain their territory. But once that happens, you have more significant deaths, and through these deaths, there's more conflict. So the Europeans bring technologies, not just the weapons, of course, but knives, axes, guns, gunpowder, lead, but they also, they bring, pots and pans. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, the Native Americans made their pots. They had clay pottery, and they cooked in those clay pots as well as carried their water and everything else. Well, these iron goods, were more durable than those pots, and so Native people basically, accepted European technologies. Guns were more efficient than bows and arrows. Their pots, cast iron pots were more, efficient than their clay pots. So again, just like in today's society, I mean, we buy these new things because it makes our lives easier, and we want the types of, technologies, these things to make our life easier, and that's what happened when Europeans came into contact with Native people. So much of what the Europeans learned to survive, they learned from the Indians, however. Remember, you have to be able to trade, and I'll touch on one other thing. To trade with native people, you have to be considered kin. How do you become kin? You have to marry into the nation and preferably have children, but certainly have a wife, a partner within the nation. So most of the early European settlers and traders, whether we're talking about in Virginia, the Powhatans, or here in North Carolina with the Tuscaroras and the other Indians that were here, most of the early white pioneers, ended up taking Indian wives. And in some cases, they would have an Indian wife and they would have a European wife. If they were moving out of Edenton to go trade with the Indians in eastern North Carolina, they might have a white wife back in Edenton, but then they would take an Indian wife, out in the Tuscarora's territory, because that made them family, that made them kin, and that allowed them to trade their goods with the native people that were there. So there was mixing very early on between Native Americans and between Europeans, and then later Africans as well, because that was the way in which native people developed friendships and relationships. And it's not unlike in Europe as well. We see the sons and daughters of the kings of France and England intermarrying to create alliances with each other, even though those nations are at war with each other and they dislike each other. And we talk about going up to World War I, they call it the concert of Europe, that basically all of the royal families in Europe, even though they went into that war, World War I, and fought the most bloody and destructive war, millions of people slaughtered, all of the royal families who led those nations that were involved in that war were related. They were cousins. So it's not uncommon for people to intermarry, and that happened extensively with native people. Well, it is a slow, gradual decline. Oftentimes, people think that the Indians were insignificant, and that there was not that the Europeans just came in and just took over. Like I said, a book that I think everyone should read is Benjamin Franklin's Indian Treatise, which was published in 1736 or 1760, 65 or so, and it chronicles the treaties, particularly with the Iroquois, the Six Nations, and the Tuscaroras and Six Nations, but with Indian peoples in the eastern, on the Atlantic seaboard, from 1736 until 1763. In that, what you understand and what we see is that native people were quite influential and quite powerful. And so through these alliances, yes, the Europeans created alliances with groups of Indians that they knew were in conflict with others, and through those alliances strengthened their position. But the native people really remained quite influential and powerful until the Revolution, the American Revolution. And it's only through their splits, their divisions, that they actually weakened their position. Because all throughout colonial American history, if we talk about the French and Indian Wars, the Iroquois are a major player in the French and Indian Wars. And actually the Iroquois split, and some of the Iroquois, Mohawks, are sided with the French, and they're fighting, on behalf of the French. And then you have the majority of the Six Nations remaining allies with the British. And they really helped to determine the outcome of major conflicts in the western part of North Carolina, Appalachia, Ohio, and the Ohio Valley. And then after the Revolution, or during the Revolution, the Iroquois split again. And so the Six Nations support the Americans, Tuscaroras and Oneidas support the Americans, and the other members of the Six Nations support the British. And because of these splits within Indian nations, they allow for the Europeans and the Americans to really grow. If we talk about very early contact, just to kind of bring it all together, disease does have an impact, because if we talk about early North Carolina history and early natives in North Carolina history, and John White's expeditions throughout eastern North Carolina along the Roanoke River, and throughout the Albemarle and Pamlico Sound and up the Neuse River, it's well recorded that everywhere they went, they spread disease, and native people began to die by the hundreds. And it became so bad that as they continued to explore and try to make contact with native people in eastern North Carolina, the Indians, when they would see them coming, they would just leave. They would move west. They would run from them, because they saw them as harbingers of death. They brought death with them everywhere they came. So that early interaction with disease does that affects that dynamic and that relationship as well. And then ultimately the colonists are interested in profit and in money. And so they're looking for a way to make money, initially hoping to find gold in Virginia and North Carolina, but when they couldn't find gold, they found the next best thing to gold, which was tobacco, which again is a native crop. A lot of people don't understand that tobacco, corn, potatoes, We call it the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash, butter beans, snap, squash, the various kinds of squashes. All of these things only existed in North America. They did not exist in Europe, nor did they exist in Africa. So when the Europeans came and interacted with native people, today many North Carolinians are as much native. They have absorbed so much native culture, so many native foods and traditions that they don't even fully comprehend it and understand it. If you go anywhere in the state, particularly eastern North Carolina, you can't find a buffet or find a restaurant that doesn't serve the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. And you grow them in your gardens. So anyone who grew up in a rural area in eastern North Carolina, they always grew these crops together in their gardens. But I doubt if very many North Carolinians, black or white, would understand that these are native crops, that they didn't exist in Europe, and they were introduced to the Europeans by the native people. So in that way, whether it's African American or European, Scotch, Irish, English, we in North Carolina and really throughout the South, but particularly here in North Carolina, have been heavily influenced culturally and in terms of our food ways and many of our behaviors and practices by native people. Coming to the slave deeds. Slave deeds are important because for African American and enslaved people, because I'm now broadening it because we've been talking about native culture and Native Americans. And I also think many North Carolinians and many Americans don't realize and understand that the first real slaves were native people. Yes, the whites brought indentured servants, and they technically were slaves, but some of the first slaves were actually native people. These conflicts that were, existed between Europeans and Indians, when they had wars, the results of those wars were peoples, women, children, and in some cases men, who were actually captured, and then they became slaves. So some of the first slaves that were shipped to the British Caribbean were Native American slaves from North America. They often shipped the men to the Caribbean, kept the women, and then they shipped African males up from the Caribbean and interbred the African males with the native women. And so the first peoples were enslaved people. And most native cultures, native people have oral traditions. They didn't have a written record, and so nor did the slaves. In fact, eventually it was against the law to educate slaves. So whether you were African, Native American, or a mix, you weren't allowed, if you were a slave, to be educated to learn to read or write. So much of their story has been, is left out. We have the records of the slaveholders, and we have the court records in which they talk about land transactions and they talk about their interactions, governing various people. But we have very little in terms of the written record about native people and African people, but particularly enslaved people. Through the slave deeds, when you read those deeds, and in North Carolina, for example, we are connected to Virginia. So northeastern North Carolina was a part of Virginia and then split from Virginia to become North Carolina. You can, through the slave deeds, actually get a written account of people, enslaved people, whether they were Indian, whether they were black, whether they were a mix of Indian and black, really going all the way back to 1619, which we're celebrating this year as the arrival of, indentured or enslaved people in Virginia. So it really it gives us an opportunity to talk about, peoples that have been left out of our narrative. And the deeds are very, very good in this regard as well, because one of the things that the deeds do is they oftentimes describe the slaves. They describe the colors of the slave, the complexion, whether they were yellow-skinned or dark-skinned. They talk about any distinguishing characteristics about the slaves. They talk about their skill sets, whether they were brick masons or carpenters or seamstresses or whatever kind of skill set they may have. So they actually give us a great deal of information about people who lived during the time side by side with white North Carolinians, who we do see recorded in census records and we do see recorded in court records, but that we don't see these other peoples there. So they're excellent resource for understanding and seeing life in North Carolina particularly, but in the South in a very different way. The state is connected, right? And the movement is from east to west. So as this project started in the central and western part of the state, but as it moves across the state and it heads to the east, really you will find the origins of the state and most of the prominent families in the state, whether they were slaveholding families or even former enslaved families. really it comes from the east. And again, the northeast, if we talk about Albemarle County, which now includes what would have been Bertie County, Gates, Halifax, Northampton, but also Perquimans, Chowan, Pasquotank, Currituck, Camden counties. Those are the oldest counties in North Carolina. And from those counties, if you take the original Bertie County, from the original Bertie County, you have Edgecombe County, Martin County, as I said, Halifax, Northampton, Gates County, were all cut from the original Bertie County. And then Bertie County was a part of the original Albemarle County, which out of that county was cut, like I said, Currituck, Chowan, Perquimans, Camden, along with Bertie County. So as you continue to kind of span the state and you go backwards, particularly to the east, if we start talking about down near New Bern, what will happen is that you will see that many of the families, slaveholding families, as well as formerly enslaved families, their roots go back to those regions, and they'll be learning more and more about their ancestors, and particularly for the enslaved people, you know, what their ancestors were engaged in, what type of activities they were involved with, and that they were pretty much here, if you talk about the mix of Native African American, you know, mix, or if you're just talking about the longevity of an African presence here in North Carolina, going back to the 1600s, you'll find that many Native North Carolinians, black and white, really have a long history, you know, hundreds of years of history that go back to those, you know, to those counties. One of the important things about the slave deeds is the opportunity to learn more about North Carolina history, the history of former enslaved people as well as those people who owned them. And although this project, the Slave Deeds Project, began in the western and in the, you know, central part of the state, Buncombe and now Guilford County, really, as we look at the other 26 counties, a number of which are in the east, that's where you're going to really find, you know, the history of the state, because the state moves from east to west. Most people who are native to the state, their history goes back hundreds of years, and it goes back to the eastern part of the state. So when we look at counties like Halifax, which was originally a part of the original Bertie County or Bertie Precinct, and out of Bertie Precinct you have Edgecombe County, Martin County, Northampton, Gates, Halifax, you know, Hertford counties basically cut out of the old Bertie County, and then the original Bertie County was a part of Albemarle County, and out of Albemarle County we end up cutting not just Bertie, but we end up cutting Chowan, Perquimans, Pasquotank, Currituck, and Camden counties. So that is, you know, we're talking the oldest counties. And if we go down to the southeast, in and around New Bern and Hanover County, again, you're really getting to some of the oldest families. And most of the families who live now in the Piedmont and in the mountains, who are in Chapel Hill or here in Greensboro or Charlotte, the families originated in the east. And they really don't stop in this region. They originate in the east, they move and cover the rest of the state, including the mountains, and then they cross over the mountains into Tennessee. Most of the families in eastern Tennessee are from families who are from the Piedmont and the western part of North Carolina. Most of the families who are in western Tennessee are basically from eastern North Carolina. They go around on the Atlantic Ocean and up the Mississippi River, or in wagon trains they travel across the mountains on 64 US, you know, Highway 64, Highway 70 out to Memphis, Tennessee. And I'll take this as an example. I worked at the University of Memphis for 10 years, and Haywood County, Tennessee, and people can look up Haywood County. All of the families in Haywood County, Tennessee came from Bertie County, North Carolina. There were several wagon trains of families. They have Pughs, Williams, Smallwoods, Bonds. All of the families that were in Bertie County in several wagon trains crossed over in the early 1800s to 1830s, and they settled in Haywood County, Tennessee. And so there's a direct tie between those families there in West Tennessee, and many of whom moved to Memphis and migrate to Memphis, and the families there. I've often talk about the Hyde family, Pitt Hyde, who is the founder of AutoZone, who's out in Memphis. And I'll give a pitch here for the Civil Rights Museum here in Greensboro. Pitt Hyde is one of the major donors for the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, where Dr. King was killed. They've made it into a Civil Rights Museum. And Pitt Hyde has given millions of dollars to the Civil Rights Museum because he understands and appreciates the importance of documenting, recording, and talking about that history. And that's just to compare with Greensboro, that we should be doing the same and to understand the value of the Civil Rights Museum here in Greensboro. But the point is, the Hyde family as well as Fred Smith, who is the founder of FedEx, which is based in Memphis, Tennessee, the Smith family. Those families have deep roots in North Carolina. They come from North Carolina, and they move out to West Tennessee. So when we talk about slave deeds, and we talk about the families that own these slaves, and we talk about their descendants, not only do we have descendants of those original families still living in North Carolina, and if you backtrack to Virginia, still living in Virginia, but we have descendants of these families also living throughout Tennessee. And then also some of the early settlers, Daniel Boone going up into Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. Many of the families in Lexington and Louisville come directly from Nashville, Tennessee, come directly from eastern North Carolina, from places like Nashville, Lexington, Smithfield. They come directly out of eastern North Carolina and go out to Kentucky and down into Tennessee. So this project, really is more than just North Carolina. If we speak on collaboration, I have to say that I've been involved with these types of community projects for quite a while in terms of history and teaching history and helping people to better appreciate and understand history. And I think that the collaborators and the collaboration that I've seen here in Greensboro definitely has been outstanding. It's been the best that I've ever had. There seems to be a genuineness with all of the people who are involved in the Slave Deeds Project to really, learn more and give the information that the public would need to understand more about why these deeds are important. I think it's important that we do acknowledge and we, talk about the collaborators on this project. And again, I feel that Jeff Thigpen really deserves a lot of credit because he has reached out as an elected official to various constituents to try to make sure that these documents were made available to the public, and all in an effort to improve the community, to help people have a better understanding, a clearer understanding of the history and heritage of Guilford County and of the Greensboro community. So yes, when we talk about all of the collaborators, whether we're talking about High Point Museum or we're talking about Guilford College, North Carolina A&T, the Civil Rights Museum, we talk about all the different groups that have been essential to where we have gotten to this point. It really starts with a willingness and an openness of people to work together and to collaborate. And I think Jeff has really exemplified this and really helped to move this community in a very good way. So so I do have to thank him and of course all the other people who have been involved with this project.
Crying out into the to reconcile. Crying out into the darkness, one sure way to feel alive. Demon mouths lined with halos, thinly veiled but no surprise. Rest assured to welcome sub thoughts of systematic lies.